Number 1. Raj Rajaratnam. In May 2011, the world of high finance was rocked by the conviction of Raj Rajaratnam, a billionaire hedge fund manager who orchestrated one of the largest insider trading schemes in U.S. history. Rajaratnam was found guilty of making over $60 million illegally by receiving confidential tips from insiders at some of the most prestigious companies in the world, including Goldman Sachs, Intel, IBM, and McKinsey. His case would not only expose the dark side of Wall Street, but also set a precedent for how the FBI would approach insider trading crimes in the future. Raj Rajaratnam, a native of Sri Lanka, arrived in the United States in the 1970s to pursue higher education. He attended the prestigious Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where he earned his MBA. He went on to found the Galleon Group, a hedge fund that quickly grew into one of the most influential firms in the financial world. Rajaratnam became known for his aggressive investment strategies and his ability to make highly lucrative trades. He was a self-made billionaire, with a reputation for being sharp and knowledgeable about the financial markets. But beneath the success was a man who would soon be exposed as a master manipulator, one who used his connections to manipulate the stock market for his own gain. At the core of Rajaratnam's operation was the illegal exchange of insider information. He would cultivate relationships with insiders at major companies, offering them a financial incentive in exchange for confidential tips. These tips gave him an edge in the stock market, allowing him to make moves that others couldn't. Rajaratnam's success in the stock market was due, in part, to his access to a network of insiders who fed him critical information that was not yet available to the public. In return, Rajaratnam would often share the profits from his trades with these sources. It was a well-oiled system of corruption, one that allowed Rajaratnam to rake in millions while others, unaware of his inside knowledge, played the market without the same advantage. Rajaratnam's downfall began when authorities began to take notice of the unusual trading patterns in his hedge fund. In 2009, the FBI launched an investigation into his activities, and soon it became clear that he had been engaging in illegal insider trading. The case was groundbreaking in several ways. Not only was Rajaratnam one of the highest-profile figures ever to be charged with insider trading, but it was also the first insider trading case in history to rely on wiretap evidence. The FBI used wiretaps to intercept conversations between Rajaratnam and his sources, providing irrefutable proof of his involvement in the scheme. During the trial, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Rajaratnam as a ruthless financier who had no regard for the law. They presented evidence of phone calls where Rajaratnam discussed sensitive information about company earnings, mergers, and acquisitions, all of which were traded on before the information became public. In one of the most shocking moments of the trial, a conversation was revealed in which Rajaratnam advised an associate to sell everything in response to an insider tip about a major company's earnings report. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was clear that Rajaratnam had been using insider information to make trades that gave him an unfair advantage over the rest of the market. The trial was a spectacle that captured the attention of Wall Street, the media, and the general public. Rajaratnam's defense team attempted to argue that the information he was receiving was not necessarily confidential, but the jury was unconvinced. In May 2011, after weeks of testimony, Rajaratnam was convicted on all charges of securities fraud and conspiracy. His sentence was handed down in October 2011, and it was a blow to the financial world. Rajaratnam was sentenced to 11 years in prison, a sentence that was at the time the longest ever given for an insider trading case. The case had far-reaching consequences for the world of finance. It sent a message to Wall Street that insider trading would no longer be tolerated, and that even the most powerful and wealthy individuals would be held accountable for breaking the law. The conviction also prompted a reevaluation of the way financial crimes were investigated. With the use of wiretaps to gather evidence, the FBI had proven that insider trading was not just a matter of suspicious stock trades, but a systemic issue that could be rooted out with the right investigative tools. Rajaratnam's conviction was a significant victory for law enforcement, but it also raised questions about the fairness of the financial system. Many critics of Wall Street felt that Rajaratnam's case was just one example of a larger problem: the pervasive culture of insider trading and corruption that existed within the highest echelons of finance. While Rajaratnam was held accountable, there were many who believed that his case was just the tip of the iceberg, and that countless others on Wall Street were engaging in similar illegal practices with impunity. The financial crisis of 2008 had already revealed deep flaws in the system, and Rajaratnam's case only served to highlight the need for reform. In the years following Rajaratnam's conviction, there was a growing push for greater regulation of the financial markets. Some argued that insider trading laws needed to be tougher, while others called for more transparency in corporate dealings. The Rajaratnam case became a symbol of the corruption and greed that had plagued the financial world for years, and it led to increased scrutiny of hedge funds and investment firms. In the end, while Rajaratnam paid a heavy price for his crimes, the case served as a wake-up call for the entire financial industry. Rajaratnam's story is one of ambition, deception, and betrayal. It is a story of how a man at the top of his game, with a reputation for brilliance and success, was brought down by his own greed and disregard for the law. His conviction marked a turning point in the fight against insider trading, but it also underscored the dark side of finance, where those with the power to shape markets can easily bend the rules to their advantage. The case of Rajaratnam remains a cautionary tale for anyone who believes they can outsmart the system and get away with it. Rajaratnam was ultimately sentenced to serve his time in a federal prison, where he would begin a long journey of redemption, although many believe that his true punishment was the tarnishing of his once respected name. The scandal surrounding Rajaratnam's arrest and conviction would have lasting consequences for the world of finance, forever changing the landscape of insider trading and leading to a heightened awareness of financial crimes. While Rajaratnam's actions may have shattered the trust of many investors, they also paved the way for a new era of enforcement, one where those who break the rules are held accountable, no matter how high they fly. Number 2, Walter Ellis. Between 1986 and 2007, a quiet and terrifying pattern unfolded on the streets of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one that would remain unsolved for more than 20 years while a serial killer lived freely among the city's residents. Walter Ellis, later known as the Milwaukee North Side Strangler, murdered 7 women over the course of 2 decades, targeting sex workers who lived on the margins of society and whose disappearances were often overlooked or misunderstood. His victims were Deborah Harris, Irene Smith, Karen Kilpatrick, Sheila Ferrier, Florence McCormick, Withrone Stokes, and Diane Olkwitz, all women whose lives ended in the same brutal way, strangled and left behind in vacant buildings, alleyways, or abandoned homes across Milwaukee's North Side. For years, the cases remained cold, scattered across different time periods and jurisdictions, allowing Ellis to avoid suspicion and continue living a seemingly ordinary life. Walter Ellis was born in 1954 and spent most of his adult life in Milwaukee. On the surface, there was nothing about him that suggested he would become one of the city's most elusive killers. He worked various jobs, maintained relationships, and blended into the neighborhoods where his victims lived and died. His crimes began in the mid-1980s, a time when law enforcement lacked the forensic tools that would later prove critical to solving the case. In 1986, the body of Deborah Harris was discovered, strangled, and discarded. Similar murders followed in the years that came after, each with strikingly similar circumstances. The victims were all adult women, most involved in sex work, and all killed by manual strangulation, a method that required close contact and significant physical force. Despite these similarities, the cases were not conclusively linked at the time, and no suspect emerged. As the years passed, more victims were found, including Irene Smith and Karen Kilpatrick in the late 1980s, followed by Sheila Ferrier in 1994 and Florence McCormick in 1995. Each time, the investigation stalled. Witnesses were scarce, physical evidence was limited, and the victims' lifestyles made it difficult for police to reconstruct their final movements. The murders faded into the background of Milwaukee's crime statistics, becoming just another set of unsolved cases in a city struggling with violence and limited resources. Meanwhile, Walter Ellis continued his life uninterrupted, never arrested, never publicly suspected, and never connected to the growing list of victims. The killings resumed in the 2000s, reigniting fear and confusion. In 2007, Wethrone Stokes was murdered, followed shortly after by Diane Olkowitz. By this point, advancements in forensic science had transformed criminal investigations, particularly the use of DNA analysis. Biological evidence collected from several of the crime scenes had been preserved, waiting for the technology that could finally unlock their secrets. Investigators began re-examining the cold cases, comparing DNA profiles across multiple murders, and for the first time, they were able to conclusively link the killings to a single perpetrator. The profile was entered into national databases, narrowing the search and bringing renewed hope to cases that had been dormant for decades. The break came when investigators identified Walter Ellis as a potential suspect through familial DNA connections and targeted testing. When Ellis was finally confronted, the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA collected from multiple victims matched his profile, tying him directly to the murders. After more than 20 years of evasion, Ellis was arrested in 2010, shocking the Milwaukee community and the families of the victims who had long feared the cases would never be solved. The arrest marked the end of one of Wisconsin's longest-running serial murder investigations and raised difficult questions about how such a pattern of violence could go undetected for so long. At trial, prosecutors laid out the full scope of Ellis's crimes, emphasizing the consistency in method, victim selection, and geography. They argued that Ellis deliberately targeted women he believed were less likely to generate sustained investigations, allowing him to operate under the radar for decades. The jury heard how each victim was strangled, a deeply personal and violent act that left little doubt about the killer's intent. The defense had little room to maneuver in the face of DNA evidence that connected Ellis to multiple crime scenes across different years. In February 2011, Walter Ellis was convicted and sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released from prison. The sentencing brought a sense of closure, but also frustration and grief. For the families of the victims, justice came painfully late. Many had spent decades without answers, haunted by the uncertainty surrounding their loved ones' deaths. The case highlighted systemic failures in how crimes against marginalized victims are investigated and prioritized, especially during earlier decades when resources and attention were often unevenly distributed. It also underscored the importance of preserving evidence, even when cases go cold, as the eventual use of DNA was the only reason Ellis was finally held accountable. Walter Ellis died in prison in 2013 from natural causes, just 2 years after his sentencing. His death closed the final chapter of the case, but it did not erase the harm he caused or the lives he destroyed. Today, the story of the Milwaukee North Side Strangler stands as a stark reminder of how serial offenders can exploit gaps in the system and how advancements in forensic science can ultimately bring long-delayed justice. The victims' names, once nearly forgotten, are now permanently tied to a case that reshaped how Milwaukee and law enforcement nationwide view cold cases, serial violence, and the lasting importance of never giving up on the pursuit of truth. Number 3. Ryan Holness, a marriage planned for murder. Ryan Holness was not some impulsive criminal acting in a moment of rage. He was methodical, patient, and deliberate, and the murder of his wife, Sarika Dunkley Holness, in June 2009 was the result of months of planning driven by greed, deception, and a double life he could no longer maintain. Holness was a former U.S. Navy air traffic controller, trained to operate under pressure, follow procedures, and tell convincing stories, and he used those exact skills to construct what he believed would be the perfect crime. Sarika was 26 years old, described by friends and family as hardworking, trusting, and deeply committed to her marriage, completely unaware that her husband had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on her just months earlier, naming himself as the sole beneficiary. At the same time, Holness was living a secret life, maintaining multiple romantic relationships while presenting himself publicly as a devoted husband, a contradiction that would eventually become a central motive in the case against him. On June 4, 2009, Holness convinced Sarika to travel with him from Brooklyn to rural Maryland under the false pretense of signing a lease for a new apartment, a normal errand that masked the reality that he was leading her directly to her death. Waiting in Kent County was Holness's accomplice, Delando Campbell, a man who had agreed to help carry out the murder in exchange for money and loyalty, fully aware of what was about to happen. In a secluded farm field, far from witnesses, Sarika was brutally stabbed to death, an act prosecutors later described as cold, calculated, and completely preventable. After the killing, Holness immediately put the next phase of his plan into motion, staging an elaborate carjacking story designed to mislead police and portray himself as another victim rather than the architect of the crime. He claimed that a masked attacker had forced their vehicle off the road, attacked them both, and fled. A narrative meant to explain Sarika's injuries while distancing himself from responsibility. To sell the lie, Campbell intentionally left his own blood at the scene, injuring himself so that investigators would find DNA evidence supporting the fabricated carjacking. For a brief moment, Holness believed the plan had worked. Law enforcement initially treated the case as a possible random act of violence, and Holness gave detailed statements filled with procedural language that sounded credible coming from someone with military training. But the story began to unravel almost immediately. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in Holness's account, timelines that did not align, and physical evidence that contradicted his version of events. The location of Sarika's wounds, the absence of defensive injuries consistent with a stranger attack, and the improbability of such a crime occurring exactly where Holness had directed her raised red flags. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered the life insurance policy, Holness's financial pressures, and his multiple affairs, all of which painted a clear picture of motive. Campbell eventually turned on Holness, cooperating with authorities and admitting his role in the murder, explaining in detail how the crime was planned, executed, and staged afterward. His testimony dismantled the carjacking narrative completely, leaving Holness with no plausible defense. In March 2011, a jury convicted Ryan Holness of first-degree murder and related charges, rejecting his attempts to portray himself as anything other than the primary architect of the crime. On June 9, 2011, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release, a permanent consequence for a crime driven entirely by self-interest. The case became a stark example of how premeditated domestic murders often hide behind ordinary routines and believable lies, and how carefully constructed cover stories can collapse under scrutiny. Sarika Dunkley Holness lost her life not because of chance or circumstance, but because the person she trusted most saw her as an obstacle to money and freedom. Ryan Holness did not act in desperation. He acted with intent, preparation, and calculation, and the life sentence he received ensured that the future he planned at her expense would never exist. Number 4. Tyler Hadley. In July 2011, in the quiet town of Port St. Lucie, Florida, a case unfolded that would become one of the most disturbing examples of teenage violence in modern American crime history. 17-year-old Tyler Hadley was an unremarkable high school student on the surface, known to classmates as awkward, socially isolated, and desperate for attention. Beneath that exterior, however, was a young man spiraling into resentment, drug use, and detachment from reality. On the afternoon of July 16, 2011, after ingesting 3 ecstasy pills, Hadley waited for his parents, Blake Hadley and Mary Jo Hadley, to return home. When they did, he attacked them one by one using a hammer. First, he ambushed his father Blake in the kitchen, striking him repeatedly until he collapsed. Moments later, he confronted his mother Mary Jo and carried out the same brutal attack. Both parents died from blunt force trauma to the head. What happened next is what cemented this case into true crime infamy. Instead of fleeing or calling for help, Tyler spent the next 3 hours methodically cleaning the blood from the floors and walls, washing himself, and dragging his parents' bodies into the master bedroom. He placed them under a sheet, locked the door, and then did something almost impossible to comprehend. Using Facebook, he invited dozens of friends to his house for a party, encouraging them to bring alcohol and drugs. That night, approximately 60 teenagers gathered inside the same home where 2 bodies lay hidden just feet away. Music blasted, drugs were used, and alcohol flowed freely. During the party, Tyler openly bragged about killing his parents, telling multiple people that they were dead upstairs. Many guests initially thought he was joking or exaggerating, but some became uneasy. At one point, Tyler reportedly showed a friend the bedroom where the bodies were hidden, lifting the sheet to reveal his parents' remains. Eventually, word spread among partygoers, and one guest anonymously tipped off the police. Officers arrived at the home in the early morning hours and quickly discovered the crime scene. Tyler was arrested without resistance and later gave a full confession. During questioning, he displayed little remorse, describing the murders in detached terms and focusing more on how the party had gone than on the fact that he had killed his parents. Investigators later uncovered that Tyler had long harbored anger toward his parents, blaming them for restricting his social life and controlling aspects of his behavior. He had also expressed violent fantasies to friends in the months leading up to the murders. Toxicology reports confirmed the presence of MDMA in his system, but prosecutors argued that the drugs did not impair his ability to understand his actions, citing the extensive cleanup and planning afterward as proof of consciousness of guilt. The case sparked nationwide outrage and debate over juvenile sentencing, social media's role in crime, and the psychological state of violent youth offenders. In 2014, Tyler Hadley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Over the years, additional controversy followed when it was revealed that Hadley had become engaged to a pen pal while incarcerated and continued to show disturbing behavior in prison, reinforcing the perception that he lacked genuine remorse. The Hadley case remains a chilling reminder of how violence can erupt inside seemingly ordinary homes and how digital culture, substance abuse, and unresolved rage can intersect with catastrophic consequences. 2 parents lost their lives. Dozens of teenagers were unknowingly exposed to a horrific crime scene, and a young man destroyed his future in a single night that continues to haunt true crime history. Number 5. Dr. Conrad Murray. On June 25, 2009, the world woke up to news that felt impossible. Michael Jackson, the most famous pop star on the planet, was dead at age 50. Almost immediately, questions began to surface, not about drugs or street dealers, but about the man who was supposed to be keeping him alive, his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray. Murray was hired specifically to manage Jackson's health during preparations for the massive This Is It comeback tour, a contract that paid him $150,000 per month. What prosecutors would later argue is that Murray was not acting as a doctor bound by medical standards, but as an enabler who prioritized his paycheck over his patient's safety. In the months leading up to Jackson's death, the singer suffered from severe insomnia, something Murray claimed he was trying to treat, but instead of following accepted medical practice, he administered powerful sedatives in a private home setting. On the night of June 24th into the early hours of June 25th, Murray gave Jackson a cocktail of drugs, including lorazepam and midazolam, before finally administering propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic normally used only in operating rooms with full monitoring equipment. According to the trial testimony, Murray injected Jackson with propofol while inside his Los Angeles mansion bedroom, then left him unattended to make personal phone calls. When he returned and found Jackson unresponsive, precious minutes were lost. Instead of immediately calling emergency services, Murray attempted CPR on a bed, a surface completely unsuitable for effective resuscitation, and waited before dialing 911. By the time paramedics arrived, Michael Jackson was already beyond saving. An autopsy later ruled the death an accident caused by acute propofol intoxication, with other sedatives contributing. The investigation quickly shifted from tragedy to criminal liability, focusing on Murray's actions and omissions during the final hours. Prosecutors argued that Murray abandoned basic medical duty by administering propofol without proper monitoring equipment, failing to keep accurate medical records, and leaving Jackson alone while the drug was active in his system. Evidence showed Murray carried propofol in his personal bag, concealed vials, and attempted to downplay the drug's role when questioned. During the trial, jurors heard audio recordings of Jackson sounding weak and slurred just days before his death, a haunting indication of how physically compromised he had become under Murray's care. Expert witnesses testified that propofol should never be used to treat insomnia, and that Murray's conduct represented a gross deviation from medical standards. The defense attempted to argue that Jackson self-administered the fatal dose after Murray stepped out, but prosecutors dismantled this claim by pointing out the drug's fast-acting nature and Jackson's weakened state. In November 2011, after weeks of testimony and intense global media coverage, Dr. Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The verdict sent a clear message that celebrity status did not excuse medical negligence. Murray was sentenced to 4 years in prison, though he served less than 2 due to California's overcrowding policies. His medical licenses were revoked, ending his career permanently. The conviction closed one chapter of the Michael Jackson saga, but left a lingering sense of loss and accountability. Jackson's death was not the result of a random accident or unavoidable condition, but of a chain of reckless decisions made by someone entrusted with his life. The case became a landmark example of how professional responsibility does not disappear behind closed doors or private contracts, and how even the most powerful figures are vulnerable when the people around them fail to follow the most basic rules meant to protect human life. Number 6. Nancy Kissel, the milkshake murderer. In December 2003, inside a luxury apartment overlooking Victoria Harbor in Hong Kong, a crime unfolded that would later be described as one of the most chilling domestic murders involving an American expatriate abroad. A case that exposed a deadly mix of wealth, resentment, and calculated deception. Nancy Kissel was married to Robert Kissel, a high-powered Merrill Lynch investment banker whose career had taken the family from New York to Hong Kong, where they lived an elite lifestyle fueled by his multi-million-dollar income and bonuses. To outsiders, the Kissels appeared successful and privileged, raising 3 children in one of the most exclusive cities in the world. But behind closed doors, the marriage was deeply fractured, marked by constant conflict, allegations of control, and mounting financial pressure as Robert's career faltered. In the days leading up to the murder, Robert Kissel had been sleeping on the couch and had reportedly told Nancy that their marriage was over, a declaration that would become a turning point in what prosecutors later described as a premeditated killing. On the morning of December 2nd, Nancy prepared a strawberry milkshake for her husband, instructing their 6-year-old daughter to deliver it to him in the living room, a detail that would later horrify investigators when they realized the drink had been laced with powerful sedatives. After Robert consumed the milkshake, he became groggy and disoriented, eventually losing consciousness, at which point prosecutors say Nancy retrieved a heavy metal figurine and struck him repeatedly in the head, bludgeoning him to death as he lay defenseless. The violence was severe, leaving blunt force injuries that made it clear this was not an accident or a momentary loss of control, but a sustained and intentional attack. After killing her husband, Nancy wrapped his body in a carpet and dragged it into a storage room in the apartment, where she sealed it inside, then went about her day as though nothing had happened, even attending a school function later that same afternoon. When authorities were eventually alerted, Nancy claimed Robert had died during a violent struggle, insisting she acted in self-defense after years of abuse. But the physical evidence told a very different story. Forensic analysis showed Robert had been heavily sedated before being attacked, contradicting Nancy's account of a spontaneous confrontation, and investigators quickly focused on the milkshake as the delivery method for the drugs that rendered him helpless. The case drew intense international attention, fueled by Nancy's background, the extreme nature of the crime, and the disturbing involvement of a child, even if unknowingly, in the events that led to Robert's death. In 2005, Nancy Kissel was convicted of murder in Hong Kong and sentenced to life in prison, but the case took a dramatic turn when her conviction was overturned on appeal due to issues related to jury instructions, granting her a retrial that once again placed the brutal killing under global scrutiny. During the retrial, prosecutors methodically reconstructed the timeline, emphasizing the planning involved, the choice of sedatives, the selection of the weapon, and the efforts to conceal the body, all of which pointed to intent rather than self-defense. The defense continued to argue that Nancy had been subjected to years of emotional and physical mistreatment, portraying her as a trapped spouse driven to desperation, but the jury ultimately rejected that narrative, focusing instead on the calculated steps taken before and after the killing. In 2011, Nancy Kissel was again convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, a verdict that brought a sense of finality to a case that had spanned nearly a decade and crossed international legal systems. The financial implications were equally significant, as Robert Kissel's estate was valued at approximately $18 million, and the murder raised immediate questions about motive, inheritance, and whether money had played a role in the decision to kill. Nancy's case became a cautionary tale among expatriate communities, highlighting how isolation, power dynamics, and unresolved conflict can escalate behind the facade of wealth and success. The image of a sedated husband, a concealed body, and a carefully maintained public appearance left an enduring impression on investigators and the public alike, reinforcing how domestic violence and lethal intent can exist in environments that outwardly appear privileged and stable. Today, Nancy Kissel remains incarcerated, her name permanently linked to one of Hong Kong's most notorious murder cases, a reminder that behind luxury high-rises and financial success, some of the darkest crimes unfold quietly, planned not in moments of chaos, but in calculated silence. Number 7. Sally Challen. In August 2010, police in the quiet village of Claygate, England, responded to a domestic homicide that initially appeared straightforward, but would later become one of the most legally significant murder cases in modern British history. Sally Challen, a 56-year-old woman with no criminal record, had beaten her husband, Richard Challen, to death with a hammer inside their family kitchen. Richard, a 61-year-old retired car dealer, was struck approximately 20 times after an argument that escalated into lethal violence. After the attack, Sally covered her husband's body with a blanket, placed the hammer nearby, and left a handwritten note that read, "I love you, Sally." She then walked out of the house and was later arrested without resistance. At trial in 2011, prosecutors portrayed the killing as an act of deliberate rage, emphasizing the number of blows and the lack of immediate threat at the time of the attack. The jury convicted Sally Challen of murder, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term, a verdict that at the time appeared to close the case as yet another example of domestic homicide. However, as years passed, new details emerged that would completely reframe how the killing was understood, both legally and socially. Evidence surfaced, showing that Sally Challen had endured decades of psychological abuse, manipulation, and coercive control at the hands of her husband, long before the term coercive control was widely recognized in British law. Witnesses described Richard Challen as domineering, emotionally cruel, and persistently unfaithful, maintaining multiple affairs while controlling nearly every aspect of Sally's life. Friends and family testified that Sally had become isolated, financially dependent, and emotionally worn down over time, showing signs of depression and mental deterioration. Psychological evaluations conducted after her conviction revealed that she was suffering from an adjustment disorder and symptoms consistent with prolonged emotional abuse, impairing her ability to respond rationally to stress and conflict. The killing itself occurred after Richard reportedly dismissed Sally's attempts to confront him about yet another affair, telling her she had no right to question him. Prosecutors originally argued that this was not self-defense and that Sally had ample opportunity to walk away, a position that reflected the legal standards at the time, which largely focused on immediate physical threat rather than cumulative psychological harm. But public perception began to shift as advocacy groups, legal experts, and journalists revisited the case, arguing that Sally Challen was not a cold-blooded killer, but a woman pushed beyond her mental breaking point after years of sustained control and emotional degradation. In 2015, the United Kingdom formally criminalized coercive and controlling behavior in intimate relationships, acknowledging that abuse does not need to be physical to be devastating. This legal shift became central to Sally Challen's appeal. In 2019, her murder conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeal after judges accepted that the original jury had not been properly informed about the effects of coercive control and mental impairment. The court ruled that the psychiatric evidence available at retrial could have led a jury to return a different verdict, recognizing that Sally's mental state at the time of the killing had been profoundly shaped by long-term abuse. Rather than being retried for murder, Sally pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. She was released from prison shortly afterward, having already served significant time, and walked free as a legally recognized victim of domestic abuse rather than a convicted murderer. The case sent shockwaves through the British legal system and became a landmark moment in how domestic homicide cases are evaluated, particularly those involving women who kill abusive partners. Sally Challen's case forced courts to confront the reality that psychological abuse can be as destructive as physical violence, and that the law must account for the cumulative impact of coercive control when assessing criminal responsibility. While Richard Challen lost his life in a violent and irreversible act, the case reshaped national conversation around domestic abuse, mental health, and justice, highlighting how the legal system can fail victims when abuse remains invisible. Today, Sally Challen's name is no longer remembered simply as a woman who killed her husband, but as the center of a case that permanently changed how coercive control is understood in British law, setting a precedent that continues to influence domestic abuse cases across the United Kingdom. Number 8. Brett Seacat. In April 2011, in the small Kansas town of Kingman, a house fire that initially appeared to be a tragic domestic incident quickly unraveled into one of the most disturbing cases of betrayal involving a trusted law enforcement officer. Brett Seacat was a sheriff's deputy, trained in crime scenes, investigations, and emergency response, someone the community believed was sworn to protect others. His wife, Vashti Seacat, was a school teacher and a mother of 3 young children. By the time investigators pieced together what truly happened, prosecutors would argue that Brett Seacat used his training not to solve a crime, but to carefully stage one. Just 2 days before the fire, Vashti had served Brett with divorce papers, ending a marriage marked by conflict, control, and escalating tension. On the night of April 30, 2011, Vashti returned home to the family residence while Brett was already there with their children. Within hours, the house would be engulfed in flames. Vashti would be dead from a gunshot wound, and Brett would claim that his wife had taken her own life. What initially looked like a suicide would soon collapse under forensic scrutiny. Fire investigators determined the blaze was intentionally set in multiple locations, a clear sign of arson rather than an accidental fire or a single ignition point. Vashti's body was found inside the home, but the fatal injury was not caused by smoke or flames. An autopsy revealed she had been shot before the fire began. Prosecutors argued that Brett shot his wife, then set the house on fire to destroy evidence and make it appear as though she had killed herself and ignited the blaze. From the start, investigators were troubled by Brett's behavior. Rather than showing panic or shock, he appeared controlled and methodical, offering explanations that shifted over time. His account of events did not align with the physical evidence found at the scene. The fire had burned too evenly, accelerants were detected, and Vashti's wound placement was inconsistent with self-infliction. Even more disturbing was the presence of the Seacat's children, who had been inside the home earlier that night and were placed at risk by the fire. Prosecutors would later charge Brett not only with first-degree murder, but also aggravated arson and child endangerment, emphasizing that the crime was not only about killing his wife, but also about exposing his own children to deadly danger. During the investigation, authorities highlighted Brett's background in law enforcement, arguing that he understood how crime scenes worked and deliberately attempted to manipulate the evidence. They alleged he believed he could outsmart investigators by controlling the narrative, staging the scene, and relying on his professional credibility to deflect suspicion. But the science told a different story. Fire patterns contradicted his version. Ballistics evidence showed Vashti had been shot before the fire, and testimony from colleagues and witnesses painted a picture of a marriage under severe strain, especially after Vashti made the decision to leave. At trial, the prosecution argued that the motive was clear. Brett was facing divorce, loss of control, and potential damage to his public image. Killing Vashti and staging the scene as a suicide, they claimed, was his way of ending the conflict permanently while attempting to escape responsibility. The defense maintained that Vashti was depressed and that the fire was a tragic result of her own actions, but jurors were unconvinced. The sheer number of inconsistencies, combined with Brett's law enforcement background, made the staged suicide theory increasingly implausible. In 2013, Brett Seacat was convicted of first-degree murder, aggravated arson, and child endangerment. He was sentenced to life in prison, a stunning fall for a man who once wore a badge and enforced the law. The case sent shockwaves through Kansas and beyond, highlighting how authority and training can be abused when someone believes they are untouchable. For many, the most haunting aspect of the case was not just the calculated nature of the crime, but the betrayal of trust, both personal and professional. Vashti Seacat was remembered as a devoted mother and teacher whose life was cut short at the moment she tried to reclaim her independence. Brett Seacat, once seen as a protector, became a symbol of how power, control, and desperation can converge into irreversible violence. The conviction ensured he would never walk free again, but it could not undo the loss suffered by Vashti's children, who were forced to grow up knowing that the person meant to protect their family was responsible for destroying it. Number 9. Carl Eagle, Roy, and Jim L. Frank. In April 2011, the city of Hartford, Connecticut, became the setting for a calculated gang-related killing that would later be prosecuted under federal racketeering laws, turning a local street murder into a case with life-ending consequences for those involved. Anthony Smooth Parker was a known figure in Hartford's street environment, associated with rival factions operating in the city's North End, where tensions between crews had been building for years through cycles of retaliation, intimidation, and territorial disputes. On the day he was killed, Parker was targeted not because of a random dispute, but because prosecutors would later argue his murder was ordered and carried out to maintain power, reputation, and fear within a criminal enterprise. Carl Eagle Roy and Jim L. Frank were both members of a Hartford-based gang engaged in narcotics distribution and violent enforcement, operating under a loose but recognizable hierarchy where status was earned through loyalty and acts of violence. According to investigators, Parker was lured into a vulnerable situation where he was confronted and fatally shot in a deliberate execution-style attack meant to send a message beyond the immediate victim. The killing was not spontaneous. It was organized, discussed, and carried out with intent, aligning it squarely with federal definitions of violent crimes committed in aid of racketeering activity. In the aftermath of the murder, fear and silence dominated the neighborhood, with witnesses reluctant to speak and initial leads drying up as cooperation evaporated. However, federal authorities began building a broader case by stepping back from the single homicide and instead mapping the gang's structure, communications, and history of criminal activity. Investigators linked Roy and Frank to a pattern of coordinated offenses, including drug trafficking, firearms violations, and violent acts intended to protect the gang's influence. Jim L. Frank eventually chose a different path than Roy, opting to cooperate with authorities after being confronted with the weight of the evidence against him. Frank pleaded guilty to committing a violent crime in aid of racketeering, admitting his role in the killing and providing detailed testimony about the gang's internal operations, the planning of the murder, and Roy's involvement. His cooperation became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, offering jurors an insider's view of how the murder fit into a larger criminal strategy rather than being an isolated incident. Carl Roy, on the other hand, maintained his innocence and took the case to trial, forcing prosecutors to rely on a combination of cooperating witnesses, forensic evidence, phone records, and testimony establishing motive and enterprise involvement. In 2016, after years of investigation and legal maneuvering, Roy was convicted of committing a violent crime in aid of racketeering and conspiracy, with the jury finding that the murder of Anthony Parker was directly connected to maintaining position and power within the gang. The sentencing phase underscored the severity of federal racketeering law, which allows punishments far harsher than typical state homicide statutes when violence is tied to organized criminal enterprises. In November 2017, Carl Eagle Roy was sentenced to life imprisonment, a penalty reflecting not only the loss of Parker's life, but the broader threat posed by organized gang violence. Jim L. Frank, due to his cooperation, avoided a life sentence, though his conviction still carried decades behind bars and permanent consequences. The case sent a clear message through Hartford and beyond, demonstrating how federal authorities can dismantle street-level gangs by treating individual acts of violence as components of a larger criminal machine rather than isolated crimes. For Anthony Parker's family, the legal outcome could not undo the loss, but it marked accountability in a system that often struggles to penetrate the code of silence surrounding gang violence. The Roy and Frank case stands as a stark example of how loyalty to a criminal enterprise can escalate ordinary street disputes into irreversible decisions, and how one act committed to prove allegiance can ultimately erase every remaining possibility of freedom. Number 10, Brandon Cecil. On December 14, 2011, a quiet apartment in Norwich, Connecticut, became the scene of a brutal and deeply unsettling crime that would haunt the local community for years. 26-year-old Jackie Worth was a devoted mother of 2 young boys, known by friends and family as kind, reliable, and completely focused on providing stability for her children. She had no criminal history, no known enemies, and no involvement in high-risk behavior. That morning, her life was cut short when she was fatally shot inside her own apartment while her children were present in the home. When police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry, no robbery, and no clear motive. Jackie had been living an ordinary life, and her death made no sense. Investigators were immediately faced with a troubling reality. This was not a random act of violence, but a targeted killing with no obvious explanation. With little physical evidence and no immediate suspects, the case quickly went cold, leaving Jackie's family and her children without answers. For years, the case remained unresolved, a painful reminder of how easily a violent crime can disappear into silence when leads dry up. As time passed, detectives continued to review evidence, re-interview witnesses, and search for anything that might reignite the investigation. But the trail remained frustratingly thin. There were no reliable eyewitnesses, no murder weapon recovered, and no clear suspect who could be definitively tied to the crime. Jackie's children were left to grow up without their mother, while the person responsible walked free. In an effort to bring attention back to unsolved cases, the Connecticut Department of Correction launched an unusual initiative. Playing cards were distributed inside prisons, each card featuring a different cold case victim. Jackie Worth's face and story appeared on one of those cards, placing her case directly in front of inmates who might recognize details or know something others did not. This strategy proved to be the turning point. In 2015, nearly 4 years after the murder, new information surfaced that pointed investigators toward Brandon Cecil. Cecil was not a stranger to Jackie, but someone who had crossed paths with her prior to her death. As detectives began digging into his background, inconsistencies in his statements and movements at the time of the murder started to emerge. Investigators re-examined phone records, witness accounts, and circumstantial evidence that had once seemed insignificant. Slowly, a clearer picture began to form. Prosecutors argued that Cecil had access to Jackie's apartment and opportunity to commit the crime, undermining any claim that the shooting was random. During the trial, the state presented a methodical case built on timelines, behavior patterns, and testimony that placed Cecil in the center of the crime. While the case lacked dramatic forensic breakthroughs, prosecutors emphasized that real-world murders are often solved through accumulation rather than a single smoking gun. The jury heard how Jackie had no reason to fear an unknown intruder, and how the circumstances strongly suggested she knew the person who entered her home that day. The presence of her children during the killing underscored the recklessness and cruelty of the act, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that this was an intentional and personal crime. Cecil's defense attempted to cast doubt on the investigation, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that the years-long gap between the murder and arrest weakened the case. But the jury ultimately disagreed. In 2017, Brandon Cecil was convicted of murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. The sentence reflected not only the loss of Jackie's life, but the lasting damage done to her children, who were forced to witness the aftermath of a violence no child should ever endure. The conviction brought a measure of closure to a case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved, and it validated the persistence of investigators who refused to let the file gather dust. Jackie Worth's case stands as a stark reminder that ordinary lives can be shattered without warning, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still arrive years later. It also demonstrated the power of unconventional investigative tools, showing how even a playing card inside a prison could reopen a door that had long been closed. For Jackie's family, the verdict did not undo the loss, but it ensured that the man responsible would no longer be free, and that her story would not be forgotten as just another unsolved name in a database.